Today we're joined by Craig Hattabaugh, CEO at Simcon Software. Simcon Software is an expert in spreadsheet accuracy and EUC self-governing controls. We've helped hundreds of companies, large and small, gain error-free spreadsheets and dramatically reduce their EUC risk through automation software. Craig, thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. Take it away.
Okay, thank you. Let's get started. So this first bullet point may sound dramatic, but it's relevant in the context of EUC inventory. Why should we do one? And in fact, in the UK last month, it did cost the CEO of a public company their job. Now, that wasn't related exclusively to a spreadsheet error, but it was related, that was really the start of a series of events that led to the resignation and ultimately the company filing for protection. But the root issue was that there were EUCs, spreadsheets in critical business processes, and they weren't well identified and thus didn't have proper controls. And that chain of events and the fact that there weren't good controls ultimately led to that unfortunate outcome. So when we talk about EUCs and high risk, there really are two things that have to be present. Number one, it's a file that's not managed by IT and it's under end user control, but also it's part of a critical business process. So I'll talk in the next slide. There's literally millions and, just huge numbers of spreadsheets, 99.99% that no one cares about. But when it's in a critical process, that's when you have the risk, and that's when you need to use tools such as an inventory and other controls to ensure that that risk is properly managed. And then the last point I wanted to make here is it's our opinion that compliance is secondary to understanding where these risks lie and the business processes that are impacted. So when we talk about a physical inventory, we're saying, XYZ file is located on this disk drive at this location. That's really not as important as understanding, again, as I just mentioned, what is the business process that would be impacted if this file were to have an error, were to become corrupted, perhaps get locked up by some type of malware and then become unavailable to the business. That's the real goal here. Obviously, and especially in regards to model inventory, it gets a lot of attention because it's required from a regulatory basis in the financial services industry. But apart from satisfying the regulatory requirement, the real goal here should be to understand these dependencies and how they can negatively impact your business. So here's our agenda. There's only 10 content slides, so we're not going to be showing a lot of PowerPoint, nor am I going to show a demo today. Simcon does provide technology in this area, and we actually have a new software as a service offering that's coming out soon that's dedicated exclusively to model inventory and spreadsheet inventory and cutting the cost and time. But we're not going to show that today, and we'll assume that you know where to find us if you're interested in learning more about that. So the one thing that's interesting about this business of EUC risk, spreadsheet risk, is many companies believe, well, I don't have it. We have our systems, our financials are on Oracle or on SAP, and we don't have these types of risks. But in our experience, you have it. Every customer, every company has it, large or small, some more than others. It may take the form of a forecast model or a pricing model that's built with Excel or macro code or some other type of scripting language. In financial reporting, sometimes it's the primary tool for a quarterly roll-up and reporting to shareholders or other regulatory agencies. Sometimes in reporting, it's often the glue, and what I mean by that is people will take an extract from this database, an extract from that database, some other numbers, put them together in a spreadsheet, and that becomes part of it. And then finally, sometimes the use of the Excel end-user controlled file is not so obvious. You may take data from the corporate database, the proverbial one source of truth. But if it goes through a spreadsheet and is transformed somehow before reaching the end destination of a report or some type of analytic, then again, you have spreadsheet risk there. So as I mentioned before, the goal shouldn't be just creating the list. We recognize that you may need to have an inventory and a list for regulatory purposes, but the real goal is understanding where these EUCs lie so that you can take proper steps to manage their risk. If you don't know where they are, if you can't see them, you obviously can't manage them. So when we talk about EUCs or end-user controlled files, again, these are the technical computing assets that aren't under direct control by an IT organization and thus don't have the proper controls in place, whether it be to, who has access to change them, et cetera, et cetera. And spreadsheets are by far and away the #1 EUC type. It's typically about 2/3 of all the EUCs out there. When you add in access databases, which are #2, you'll generally cover 80 to 90% of your risk in this area. But the one thing we wanted to call your attention to is, the use of self-service analytic tools like Tableau or ClickView, ClickSense. Those have been in place now for a number of years and are pretty pervasive. Almost most companies we talk to have them. And when those are part of a critical decision-making process, the risk of those tools is almost identical to that of a spreadsheet, because typically there's data there, there's data embedded, or there's data in links, and that analytic is often under end-user control. So again, that combination of an end-user controlled application and it's used in a critical decision-making process, which those tools often are, then you have EUC risk, and those really should be part of your inventory. Most companies don't put them in their inventory because a regulator doesn't ask. But again, our assumption is you're building an inventory not just to tick the box for the regulator, but you're doing it in order to understand where your EUC risks lie. And in that sense, those types of tools should be part of the inventory. So what's the starting point? How do you get started? The first step is you need some type of standard or policy to help you determine what goes into the inventory and what doesn't. Whether your company has thousands of spreadsheets, millions, tens of millions, the typical inventory is measured in hundreds or low thousands. So how do you winnow down this huge list into something to determine what goes in? Again, as we mentioned, kind of the two high-level criteria to determining what should go in is it used in a critical process, and is it complex and thus more prone to error? Those are kind of, again, high level, the two things that are your metrics for determining should they go in or not. And one of the problems that people face on a day-to-day basis when making these decisions is the subjectivity around it, especially around things like criticality. So you can have technical thresholds, i.e., if a file has macro code or not. That might be one of your criteria for determining risk. Or if it's connected to more than 5 other spreadsheets, then we believe that that is more complex than the average person can sort out manually, and thus it's going to go into a more controlled environment. There's lots of different technical thresholds, but there's lots of subjectivity around criticality. And by that we mean, is this spreadsheet part of a financial reporting process? Is this spreadsheet part of a control in our SOX process? Is this spreadsheet or other EUC file used for critical decision-making, such as pricing of a product, whether it be some type of investment product or an insurance product? So this combination of, the real point we're trying to make here is the more you have a standard or a reference point for people to compare to, the easier it is to eliminate subjectivity and the higher quality end result that you get. But regardless of whether you're keeping track of this on a list in Word or in Excel, or you have a more sophisticated IT system to keep track of your inventory, it all starts with a taxonomy that enables you to classify these files in different categories and get rid of 99.9% of them, and take the remaining ones, and that is what becomes your inventory going forward. So when it comes to keeping track of the actual inventory itself, there's lots of different ways to do that. Obviously, the first one is an option for everyone unless you're regulated. Again, as I mentioned, in financial services industries, a model inventory is almost mandatory. The line becomes more fuzzy when it relates to if it's not a model, right? If it's just some type of calculating tool, then from a regulatory standpoint, it doesn't have to go into the inventory. But if your objective is to, again, reduce risk by understanding where these EUCs impact a critical business process, you'll want it to go there. But again, if you're not regulated, you have the option to say, hey, we're not going to keep an inventory, and what I don't know won't hurt me. It's ironic when we move to the second point. Excel is the #1 EUC type, and Excel is also the #1 inventory system. Most companies, especially smaller to mid-sized companies, keep track of their EUCs in some type of basic registry that's maintained in Excel. Some go a step further, and they might have an Excel spreadsheet that has 2 or 3 pages, and people have to ask those self-attestation questions that I just mentioned. Things like, is this file used as part of a regulatory reporting process? And so you might have a spreadsheet with 2 or 3 pages that describe all the metadata about this EUC, and then someone has to go about manually collecting that and putting it into reports and making sure it's kept up to date and so forth. But we'd be lying to you if we said that that wasn't the most popular tool for keeping track of an inventory. It is. Some people choose location dependent. Let's say it's a SharePoint repository, and by definition, if it's in this file, it's important and it's part of our inventory, and then they'll just use standard utilities of SharePoint to report on what's in there. So that concept of anything that's important, we're going to move into this one place, and then it certainly makes it easier to keep track of. It requires a lot of cooperation from the line of business, but it's a valid method, it works, and people do it. So obviously there's commercial applications. SimCon makes these tools. We're not going to go into it more detail than that, and as I mentioned before, we assume that if you're interested in those, you know where to find us. Finally, there's the enterprise risk management platforms, things like RSA Archer or MetricStream. Those tools can be adapted to keep track of an inventory, and or larger companies sometimes build a custom system to manage their inventory. So there's lots of different ways to keep track of the inventory, but the challenge really isn't the system per se. The challenge is identifying the files that should go in and then keeping it up to date. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail here. So if you're in risk, or if you're in the line of business but you're responsible for making sure this inventory happens, you can't build it in a vacuum. The line of business has to be involved. At the end of the day, it is their risk. If you're in the second line, it's not your job, it's not your risk, you don't own it. But the line of business owns the risk, and they need to participate in their own rescue, because ultimately the risk mitigation helps them and protects their jobs. But their time and their patience is finite. There's a reason things are under end user control, whether it's speed, agility, some sense of, controlling my own destiny. It varies from person to person. But when it comes to how much time do they have available to document, 40 questions from a risk questionnaire, it's finite, as I said. So it's key there to getting them to participate, but to get them to participate and to remain engaged, you have to maintain a balance there. Other challenges, once the inventory is built, is how do we know it's complete? How do we survive, or address the challenges that may be put forth by an auditor, whether internal or external? Keeping it accurate, keeping it up to date, that's probably the biggest challenge. It'll take a lot of effort to gather this information, but once it's there, how do you keep it up to date? We were talking with a customer the other day, a prospect, and they described to us how they had 1,332 macros in a particular inventory that they were keeping track of. And that was the number as of March of last year. And as of March of this year, they had exactly the same number, which is practically impossible. They either deleted some or they should have added some, but that tells you the inventory really wasn't being kept up to date. So all of these challenges are part of keeping an inventory, but they're solvable, and at the end of the day, they're worth it. They can be overcome, and the benefits of having the inventory far outweigh the effort required to overcome these challenges. As I mentioned before, keeping track of inventory can be done manually. It can be done with the help of systems. The lesson here is the more you can take advantage of a system, the more you can ease the burden on the line of business, the more you can ease the burden on the risk personnel that have to ensure this data is there and report on it, the better off you'll be. The higher the probability that the work will actually get done, the more consistent the output, i.e. you'll be applying the same metrics to everyone, the same criteria to everyone. It just results in much, much higher quality output of the data that you get. So, and there's lots of areas and opportunities to leverage automation here. So one is just surveying the raw landscape of EUCs. Most companies have a list. They already have some idea of this is the list of the 72 or the 339 that are important and are part of our inventory. But some companies have no idea. So if you have a list, how do you ensure and, effectively challenge the business and see that that list hasn't changed, like the company that I referred to before with the macro inventory that clearly wasn't being kept up to date. So this concept of using scanning technology that can go out, look at a shared drive on a network and a file share or a network disk, and it can tell you what files are there and how many were changed and so forth. So you can use automation in that context, either to build an initial inventory or to do spot checks and updates on an existing one. When it comes to file complexity, with the proverbial click of a button, you can get a complete output of how much macro code is in this file, how many other spreadsheets is it connected to, how many other databases is it connected to, how many formulas do we have. We have customers that have models that have literally 2 or 3 million formulas in them. So that type of complexity is almost impossible to determine manually. So you can leverage tools, you can leverage automation to objectively assess that. And the key word is objective, because most people don't want their file to go into an inventory. Most people assume, and perhaps correctly, that if it goes into inventory, then I'm going to be under a spotlight, then I'm going to have scrutiny, and I'm going to have to do more work. So if you don't have objective standards, people can use that wiggle room to try to get out and keep their file out of the inventory. Again, complexity isn't the only equation for risk. Understanding where it fits in a critical business process is equally, if not even more important. And administering those questionnaires takes a lot of time and effort. And to the extent you can automate that, it's great. Calculation of a risk score, again, doesn't save that much time, but ensures it gets done the same way every time. At the end of the day, people need to report on the metrics, produce dashboards as to the risk. How many of these EUCs do we have? How many are high risk? What's the degree of change that's taking place? There are tools out there that can automate the production of that type of reporting. Some of the more advanced or sophisticated companies out there who are really on top of their EUC risk will have workflows, particularly approval workflows that will keep track of when was the last time the questionnaire was updated, or if the questionnaire data, the attestation data becomes out of date, it'll trigger an email to the user to make sure they go in and update it. So there's lots of different ways to leverage automation here. The good news is you don't have to do it all. You don't have to do any of it if you don't want to. Automation has a very clear value proposition. It's either worth doing or it's not. So you can pick the area that may make sense for you to do, and then you can, go forth and do it and get tools that'll help in that area. Or if it's a small task, you can just continue to do it manually. So again, we can't emphasize enough, the average Joe doesn't care about an inventory. It's end user computing for a reason. They want to get their work done and not be bothered. So, but you do need support from the line of business. So I speak all the time about maintaining that balance. That balance is different from each company, for each company, but you need to find it and maintain it. Recognize that documenting risk information about an EUC is a burden, and the inventory itself doesn't prevent errors, so you're not really helping the end user by just collecting their information for an inventory. So just make sure you keep that balance there for both the risk management needs as well as the end user who has to provide the data. Just starting to sum up here in terms of best practices. So it's having objective standards for determining what files go into the inventory and what stays out. The more objective, the better. When it comes to determining what is a high-risk file, use multiple factors. So complexity metrics are often, they're a proxy for risk in that the more complex a file is, the harder it is to error check and the more things there are to go wrong. The self-assessment data on criticality is, no pun intended, critical, right? Is this file part of a business process or a critical business process? There are millions and millions of these types of files out there. A very, very small fraction are important, and so that criticality assessment is key. And then many companies have other systems like data classification that will often say a file is, highly sensitive information, can't be circulated outside the company. That should be part of your risk rating. You could have a file that had critical information but wasn't complex and really wasn't part of a process, but for whatever reason it was in that file. That should be high risk. It should be tracked. It should be in your inventory. Automate wherever you can. Again, automation is key to making sure the work gets done, making sure it gets done consistently, and minimizes the burden from the line of business, which is important. If you're a large company and have an enterprise risk management platform, best practice is that you integrate the key risk indicators pertaining to EUC risk and have those automatically fed into that platform. And then finally, you know, building the inventory is just the starting point. Keeping it up to date and making sure it's current is just vital, or else it's not worth doing. And best practice is that the maintenance process, the process by which that information is kept up to date, is sustainable. So again, for a small company that may only have 14 models they're keeping track of, I would say a manual process is sustainable. Maybe it's augmented with a few desktop tools, but it's sustainable. But if you have several hundred of these models, the process of manually trying to collate and collect, you know, criticality information and make sure it's up to date, it could consume someone for, you know, 3 to 6 person months a year, and that isn't sustainable. Last slide before the closing. This is optional. You know, in the end, the inventory alone doesn't reduce that risk that much. You really, what you're looking for is to have more effective controls in place, and you can't do that without an inventory. So the good news is if you do the inventory and it's up to date and it's accurate, you're now in a position to improve your control strategy. You know, frequently with spreadsheets, people will say, the answer to reducing spreadsheet risk is get rid of the spreadsheets. Sometimes that is the case, but the root core issue is lack of effective controls, and by having an inventory, knowing what's high risk, knowing what's part of a critical business process, you're in a position to have the controls. So with that, I'll stop and open it up to questions.